today, another real world test. Today we're doing it on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V, the latest flagship phone from Sony that's aimed specifically at content creators. So we'll test it out, all while we explore today as per the usual. But first things first. Coffee, check. And welcome back to Bushwick. This is a neighborhood here in Brooklyn in New York City. But it was originally part of the town the Dutch settled in 1661 and called Bushwick, which translates to wooded area, which was apropos considering this entire area would have been basically trees and farms back then. And it would have also included the now very distinct neighborhoods in their own ways of Greenpoint, where I share a studio with Michael Fisher of Mr. Mobile and Jaime Rivera of Pocket Now, who you might know, and Williamsburg, where I actually live. Now in the 1800s, this area would have been breweries and factories mostly, and like most of Brooklyn at the time, the industrial nature of the area would have declined in the mid-1900s. It wasn't until the 90s that the area started to attract artists, and at this point it's sort of become known for those artists and the nightlife, and there are some really cool art exhibits here, as well as plenty of breweries still. Also, like a lot of Brooklyn, good coffee shops like Dweeb's here that just has a chill local hipster vibe really, which generally translates to a good latte and obviously an avocado toast. I'm simple and I'm basic, I can't help it. Speaking of things that probably won't change, let's talk about the styling of the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V. Now, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V's design is very similar to the Xperia 1 Mark IV before it. The dimensions are, as near as makes no difference, the same micro SD card slot that everyone kind of expects now on the series, along with the same 3.5mm headphone jack, the same dedicated camera button, the same IP6568 water-resistant design, the same side-mounted fingerprint sensor, which I actually really like because it's fast and it's kind of where your finger normally sits when you're holding the phone anyway, so that's convenient. Now the screen is the same 6.5-inch 21:9 OLED HDR BT 2020 120Hz display that has a listed resolution of 4K. I say listed because just like the Xperia 1 Mark IV as well, while running a display info app, the phone is actually running at FHD Plus most of the time. It's capable of 4K-ish, but apparently it only turns on 4K if you have creator mode on in the settings, which I do, and you're in a multimedia app playing 4K content. Regardless though, the screen is sharp and that definitely saves battery, which is important. But saying it's a 4K display when it only is some of the time seems a little weird to me, but whatever. And lastly, even the weight is basically the same. The only difference you can see is the fact that we have ridged edges, which make for better grip, but I also just kind of like the look of them, and a textured Gorilla Glass Victus 2 back that makes for less fingerprints and a better grip as well, but also again, I just kind of like the look of it. We also have a different camera hump with things moved around slightly, and the hump itself being larger. But I like the look, and it still very much feels in line with the usual Xperia look. If you look closely here though, you'll notice one new thing, and that's a rear-facing mic, which will come in handy when we test the video on here later on. Now for colors, we have the usual black, which I have here, but there's also a khaki green color, which I actually kind of think is the best color, and it's coming to Sony's online store exclusively. Then we have a platinum silver color that will only be available outside of the United States. There is a new Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chipset inside, which when paired with the 120Hz display, 12 gigs of RAM, and the Minimalistic Sony Ui, it makes everything feel super fast, honestly. I'm also starting to notice a bit of a pattern that most of the phones that I've tested with this new chipset tend to feel that way, so there might be something to that. A quick note about that 120Hz display, by the way, it is off by default, and I've turned it on for this video, but when you do turn it on, it is on all the time. It's not adaptive, unlike other flagship phones that will drop the refresh rate to save battery based on what's on the screen. Now we also have the same general software experience and apps as well, and so with all of that, is there anything different about the phone? Well, yes there is. So we've actually visited this place before in my Samsung A52 real world test video that I filmed years ago at this point, but it changes constantly. So I'm actually excited to see what's new here. So welcome back again to the Bushwick Collective. And this is the largest outdoor street art gallery in the world. And it's a collection of, as I mentioned, ever-changing art created by locals and international artists even. It was founded back in 2011 by a local and since then has become a huge draw for visitors to this neighborhood. It's just a nice way to spend a Sunday afternoon and also a great place to test out the cameras on the Xperia 1 Mark Mark V. And this brings us to the first of those differences on the Xperia 1 Mark V compared to the Xperia 1 Mark IV, and it's actually quite interesting, but it's also kind of technical, so bear with me. Firstly, we have the same ultra-wide camera on this as we did on the last phone, and the same telephoto camera that I previously praised as a technical marvel, since able to move the lens inside the camera similar to how a real zoom lens would work. And it can go from 3.5 times to 5.2 times zoom, and the bump the Xperia 4 got over the 3, which could similarly zoom like this, was that the 4 and the 5 now as well don't jump from 3.5 to 5.2. You actually get an optical zoom from 3.5 all the way to 5.2, so even shots in between those two lengths are optically zoomed. Again, like a real zoom lens. I still think this is brilliant, and I want this to be the way that we use our cameras on our phones for the entire range, like all the way from ultra-wide to full telephoto really far away, just one really good sensor with this kind of technology. That would be amazing. But I digress. Now those two cameras again are the same here on the Xperia 1 Mark V as they are in the Xperia 1 Mark IV. But now we have not only a new main camera, but we have an all-new sensor type in that main camera. Now a quick refresher on Sony's Exmor line of camera sensors, which are the sensors that you see in every Sony camera as well as most phones out, including your iPhone even. Sony just happens to be the largest camera sensor manufacturer in the world. Right now we have the less seen these days Exmor sensor. Then we moved to the Exmor R, which was a back illuminated sensor, which means that instead of the usual setup where light comes into the pixels and has to go through the wiring before hitting the photodiode, the part of the sensor that fills with photons, aka light, the photodiodes and light receiving surface are swapped with the metal wiring. The setup is reversed basically, and that's where the R comes from in the name. This stops the wiring from obstructing some light, which allows smaller sensors to have higher resolutions without decreasing the light sensitivity. Then we got the Exmor RS, which is the same reverse layout as the R, but it's also stacked, which is where we get the S from. So instead of the backlit pixel section being next to the circuits for signal processing, these circuits are now stacked behind the pixel section, and Sony eventually added DRAM in between these as well. Now this basically made reading the sensor faster, a bump in light capturing, and helped make them even more compact. The Exmor R and the Exmor RS are actually available in a ton of flagship phones, but they're also in Sony's proper cameras. An Exmor R sensor, for example, is in the ZV-E1 that I'm using to shoot this video, and the A7S III that I usually use. The Exmor RS is in the Sony A9 and A1, and it's what allows them to get those crazy fast burst rates, for example. Now though, with the Xperia 1 Mark V, we have a brand new Exmor T sensor. Now this new sensor takes the RS backside illuminated stacked sensor that has the circuits separated from the pixels, and it separates things further by taking the transistor layer that would normally be paired with the photodiode and moving it to its own layer on the sensor. This allows the photodiode itself to be deeper, which means it can gather a claimed double the amount of light per pixel while keeping the pixel size the same, which should increase dynamic range of the camera. And this also means the pixel transistor can be made larger, which should reduce noise in the final image. Something else exciting about this, to me personally at least, is that it seems that Sony uses the Xperia lineup to produce and test out these sensors. Once they're used here, they make their way to other phones, and even more excitingly again for me, they eventually make their way up to mirrorless cameras. It turns out it's easier to make these smaller and then over time scale the size up. So I'm excited to see what a full frame version of this new sensor will do one day. Now besides the new sensor type and what that entails, there are a few other pretty interesting things about this new main camera. Next, it is a 4.3x3 aspect sensor instead of the usual 4x3. Basically that means that when you shoot a video at 16:9 aspect, which crops a typical 4x3 sensor, you lose a good portion of the top and bottom of that sensor. But with a 4.3x3 sensor, there's less the top and bottom crop, so we're able to use more of the sensor, which should mean more light. Now in this case, we have a 52 megapixel sensor, but for a 4x3 photo, you'll get 48 megapixels cropped out of it. This is in a quad Bayer pattern, so the sensor has pixels in collections of 4 of the same color. 4 red, 4 green, 4 blue, repeating as they normally do across a sensor like this. And unlike other phones that will allow you to shoot the full 48 megapixels by demosaicing the data from the sensor to change it back to a more traditional RGB Bayer layout in the final image, Sony won't let you. Which I honestly don't mind, as I and most people I know almost never change to the full resolution, since it's only really useful if you're printing something out, since we now all have these telephoto cameras to zoom in optically with instead. And also causes you to lose the computation of photography aspects of the photos, which is, if we're honest, largely responsible for how good the photos from these tiny sensors end up being. Speaking of that, Mika, a massive, especially for New York City, 6,000 square foot art-focused bar here in Bushwick. It was started by a husband and wife team, John Du and Mika Furuya. Mika, the designer of the space and for whom the bar is named, is from Tokyo, while her husband, Shanghai. And in a very Bushwick fashion, it's situated inside of a disused warehouse. There's plenty to drink on the menu, all of it kept as local as possible, but also some delicious Japanese-oriented bites, as well as shuffleboard, darts, and billiards to play, and it's all surrounded by art from local artists. It's a very cool space. After telling Sony for literal years that they need to do the same kind of software magic that their competitors do using Sony sensors in their phones even, instead of just the very basic editing to the raw data that they usually do, they've finally done it, or at least more of it. Now I'll let you guys be the judge throughout the video of how you think the camera's doing versus the usual suspects, but let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Now images taken on the default basic mode do a better job of editing the image as you take it to give a slightly better looking photo than you used to right out of the camera, at least in most situations. Again, you can see samples throughout the video and be the judge yourselves. And they finally added night mode. It needs a little bit of work, but we finally have night mode on a Sony Xperia phone. Now you can also easily use basic mode to shoot videos quickly. They also added an S-Cinetone color profile, which is a popular lower contrast filmy look from their alpha cameras, and should in theory have your Sony alpha camera match better to the phone if you set them both to that setting, which is what I left both my ZVE1 and the Xperia 1 Mark V on for the majority of this video, just to see if I could get it to match the shots throughout the video a bit better. Now even with this, you can still switch over to the more advanced shooting modes for photos in the Photo Pro app, and you have more manual controls and features than any other phone I've ever used if you want, as well as do the same in the Video Pro app for video. And they finally added something that I know myself and many other creators were asking for, but we're gonna pretend that it was solely because of me, into the phone, which is focus peaking. So now when you rack focus, a feature I love to use on Xperia phones, you can easily see what's in focus, and you can use it for focus in general, of course, as well. Speaking of video, we can still shoot in 4K up to 120 FPS on all the cameras, which is great. Now the idea for that is that you then get the freedom to choose to slow it down in post as you see fit, or just leave it as a normal speed shot, instead of slow-mo mode on a phone that usually forces you to decide to make something a very specific slow motion speed when you're shooting. It's just a good tool that I see a lot of creators using on their regular cameras, either shooting at 120 or 60 FPS. The object tracking in video on the latest Xperia phones has always been good, and it remains so here. And we can now adjust the mic to record only from that new rear-facing mic to get whatever is in front of the camera, like a shotgun mic would work, or switch it to all to get omni sound from all around. Oh, and we also finally have the UI switch to vertical now in Video Pro. We still have the Cinema Pro app, which I've never really found that useful, but it crops the image to a 21:9, and it gives you LUTs that you can use, including one that mimics the Sony Venice very expensive cinema camera that they have. But to me, this kind of just feels a little gimmicky, and is just another app on the phone to further confuse people that I feel like you could just put the aspect ratio option and those LUTs in the Video Pro app and just call it a day. You can also live stream from the phone in 1080p. You can also use the phone as a monitor and a streaming device for your Sony Alpha camera too. It'll give you a bunch of useful video assist features like professional monitors do, and you can stream wirelessly from your camera through the phone's internet connection in 4K actually, which is new to this phone. It's just a cool way to create a wireless live streaming setup with your actual camera. And lastly, there's the Music Pro app, which we didn't really get to test fully on the Xperia 1 Mark IV as it wasn't ready when I had the review unit for that, but now it's here. And after feedback from multiple creators, including myself, again, we're gonna pretend it's solely because of me, the Music Pro app, we all kind of realize as video creators, we don't use obviously for music, but it would be great for voiceovers and for podcasts. And it actually does a pretty good job of making the mics on the phone sound a bit better. Basically, you record on the Recorder app, you then upload it to Sony's services, their cloud service, it does its AI magic, and then you re-download it with all of the effects that you want. But that service for tuning the audio does cost $5 a month for a 1,000 megabyte limit of uploading, which seems like a money grab for recurring revenue like every phone company seems to be trying to do all of the time now. I'm looking at you, iCloud and Google Photos. The other option option you have though is to buy a nicer mic, actually, and you can easily plug that into the 3.5mm audio jack as it accepts input and not just output. Sony also offers a monitor that clamps onto the phone, and it plugs into the USB-C port, and it gives you a screen on the back of the phone to be able to use the much better rear cameras when filming yourself, as well as a cold shoe mount to add a shotgun mic or other mic, and then you can plug that into the 3.5mm jack as well. Since we have that, and we don't need the single USB-C or Lightning port for it like we would if we were using another phone. Okay, and something that needs to be addressed. The last time I did a real-world test on an Xperia phone, it overheated multiple times during filming, and other reviewers all had the same issues. So, this time, Sony made a point to say the new chipset is more power efficient, but also camera power consumption has dropped by 20%, and they made the heat diffusion sheet inside the phone 60% larger, and all of that should help keep thermals down. And I can say with using this phone all day to film, I haven't had a single overheating issue. So, maybe it's sorted. Okay, calling it a night. As far as battery is concerned, my battery died at about 9 p.m. and I recharged it using a battery pack that I had, but when it died, here's my screen on time and my usage for anyone who's curious about that. Please keep in mind though, today is a real world test day. It's not a normal day. I use the camera a ton, but here's another day that was not a real world test day, so you have something more normal to compare it to. Now, battery life overall, definitely better than last year. Hands down, also didn't overheat, not once. Massive improvements in that respect. Honestly, I will say actually the battery life is pretty good in general. I was very surprised by that. On a real world test day like this, it should have died a lot sooner than it did. So battery, not bad at all. The Xperia 1 Mark V definitely feels like a huge improvement, even when some of those things are just little things, but they've done all of them finally. It feels like a big jump from the 4. As far as the photos and videos are concerned, I'm very curious what you guys think. Please let me know in the comments what you thought of all of the footage and all of the photos from this compared to all the other devices in here. Always appreciate hearing from you guys. Now, the Xperia line is always interesting to me. I always like to kind of speculate on why that division exists, really, because you can't imagine it makes Sony a ton of money, especially compared to their other divisions. So is it a PR thing, just to like kind of say that they're in the space? Or is it, as I've shown before in past videos, something to sell as an add-on to their real cameras to high-end business customers that have money to spend and don't mind paying the high prices for, say, the Xperia Pro I, for example? Hey, NFL and the broadcasters there. Using it, a Sony Alpha camera, and a gimbal. They called it the poor man's Steadicam. There's also those very shallow depth of field shots that you would see occasionally in NFL games, and probably will see more of. And honestly, it's probably a bit of both of those things. But I also think now, with this sensor in this phone, that it's also kind of a test bed and kind of some research and development for Sony to try out their newer sensors at, again, this much smaller, easier to manufacture size, see how it does, gain data on it, all of that stuff, so that they can eventually upscale that and bring it to their much more profitable camera lineup. Regardless, I do really like the fact that this is a creator's phone and that Sony is aiming at that and they're not trying to go after the mainstream of Samsung and iPhone as best as they can. And while I definitely think that this model is getting way closer to that reality of maybe even being like the secondary device that I bring with me in my bag in addition to my phone, like it becomes my B cam, it's an interesting concept. It's getting closer to that, but it still costs $1,400, which is cheaper than last year's model. That's nice. but it's still quite expensive in a world of flagship phones. But again, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Appreciate hearing from you guys. I will leave a link below to the best price that I could find on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V. And keep in mind, a lot of times with these Xperia devices, they tend to go on sale quite a chunk, not too long after they're launched. I will also keep that link updated with the best price that I could find as well. All right, subscribe, ding the bell if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. Check out the rest of the Real World Test series. Explore other places while we play with other pieces of tech. I am exhausted, I'm fried. I think it's time for bed. So, good night. Plane. Another plane. More planes. Planes, people. Even on a quote-unquote quiet street. Brooklyn tumbleweeds. Go away. Shh, shh. Where are you guys? Oh, there's a nest. Damn. Of course there's a nest. Plane.